Hello, and thank you for joining us for Summer Nights at Home, an online version of our annual Summer Nights event. We hope that you're all staying healthy and safe. My name is Korinna Domingo. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a community science coordinator at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Today, we'll be discussing what wildlife has been up to at the museum before and during the Safer at Home orders. Here to share with you some of the interesting mammal activity in our nature gardens is Miguel Ordeñana, pronoun he, him, his, manager of the Community Science Office here at the museum. Welcome, Miguel.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Miguel Ordeñana joined the museum in 2013 and is an environmental educator and wildlife biologist. As a community science manager, Miguel promotes and creates community science projects and recruits and trains participants. Miguel utilizes his mammal research background by conducting urban mammal research in LA and co-leads the museum's Southern California Squirrel Survey. Miguel continues to work locally and internationally on carnivore and bat research, including a jaguar project in Nicaragua. So before we launch into talking about wildlife behavior at the gardens during the pandemic, can you give our listeners some background information on the nature gardens at the museum? What are they and why were they developed in the first place?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. So the nature gardens were part of an initiative that were motivated by our 100th year anniversary back in 2013. And during that time, we wanted to alter our mission to place more focus on celebrating local nature here in Los Angeles and educating the public on what's out there, why it's so biodiverse, and what people can expect to find in Los Angeles. And we did that by creating a few exhibits. One was an exhibit called Becoming LA. It was a history of LA and our intersection of culture and nature here in Los Angeles. We also have the Nature Lab, which is focused on an indoor exhibit focused on urban nature. But then the Nature Garden served a different purpose as an outdoor exhibit that featured drought-tolerant plants, California native plants, and just different habitat that is indicative and representative of Los Angeles ecosystems. And so part of the goal was to introduce people to that and how biodiverse and animal friendly our ecosystem and Mediterranean climate is, and some of the specific plants that people can not only see out in parks but potentially grow in their apartment courtyards or backyards, and what type of wildlife are attracted to those plants, and a lot of pollinators especially. And so yeah, so it's introduction to local wildlife and habitat, but also it's also a training site for community science, and just kind of a training site for students to get comfortable around nature, and also a wildlife monitoring site as well. So our entomologists have an insect trap that's been there since the very beginning. And I forgot to mention, it's only 3.5 acres, and it was previously concrete as a parking lot. And so it's just a huge drastic change from what it was. And when I got here, it was just getting started as far as opening to the public, and the plants were still establishing. So the question for me and a lot of other scientists was, what wildlife are using this garden now, and how will that change in the future as these plants begin to establish and we start using this garden differently?
Great, thank you for that background, Miguel. As many of you are aware, the museum closed its doors back in March of this year due to COVID-19. Perhaps, though, one silver lining in all of this may be that there was a new opportunity of being able to observe wildlife in the nature gardens and around the museum during a time where human activity in these spaces dramatically decreased. So give us a rundown on what tools you've used to detect wildlife in these spaces throughout the years, and generally kind of how they work.
Yeah, so the tools that I use are camera traps, which are used to study terrestrial mammals that travel on the ground. a lot of which are nocturnal. The only mammal that's not nocturnal that lives in LA is a squirrel. And the camera trap could be handy for that too, because there is a rare squirrel called the western gray squirrel that you can't really get if you're around in some areas. And so, so camera traps are really handy to document elusive and nocturnal animals, because you can leave these camera traps like this one here. Oops, there it goes. And put it out. Oh man, put it out for a little while, and it'll capture all the wildlife and activity that's passing through that particular area, whether it's your backyard, a park, or the museum even. And so these are really handy tools because they're motion activated. We don't have to be there to scare the animal away potentially. And so, and a lot of times they come with infrared flash, which is good to keep your camera safe because people won't even see them either at night, but also not to spook the animals too much, which can happen if you use a regular flash. For bats, because they're so small, they come out at night and they fly high in the air, you have to use a device that records their echolocations, also known as sonar. And they use echolocation to navigate in space at night, to communicate with each other, and to also hunt. And they use these really high-pitched ultrasonic calls to basically get a mental picture of what's in front of them through sound. And it's an amazing ability that they have, but also so cool. It is species specific. And so by getting these recordings and capturing it with a very sensitive microphone, we're able to identify what species are using what area.
Bat detectors and trail cameras. Love it. So what were some of your goals of setting up trail cameras in the nature garden during the museum shutdown? What were you hoping to detect or observe?
Yeah, so during the museum shutdown, I was hoping to observe if animal activity changed, or even species, the type of species that visit the garden, if that changed as well. And I wasn't very optimistic that we'd see much change because it's such a short amount of time. So we detected a lot of urban adapted species that really could care less whether humans were there or not, for the most part. But yes, humans do have an impact on animal activity, even if you're a very urban adapted species. So I was hoping to at least see them be out more often at night, maybe even earlier in the evening or during the day. But even with the closure, we did have security walking through and our garden staff. So it wasn't totally empty and deserted. So I didn't expect too much, but it was worth a shot anyway. And I was curious, and my very I don't know, hopeful side of me was like, oh, maybe a coyote will jump the fence and snack on a cat or a squirrel or something. But that didn't happen. Spoiler alert. But it was cool to see what did happen. There was some really cool behavior that I was able to capture, and I'm happy to share some of that.
Let's take a look at some of the videos you got on the trail cameras. First off, I just want to say it's pretty incredible to see the diversity of species that are using the nature gardens and the museum spaces in general.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of those species are displaced by people, like the red-tailed hawk that you saw, ducks. For some reason, they seem to be shy when there's too many people around. And when we do see ducks, it's usually like before the museum opens, only sometimes during the year. So it's good to see that they're just making use of our ponds while the public was gone. They were there almost all the time I went to visit the museum while it was closed. And then it was cool to see the cats roaming around, but in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, what does this mean for birds? And that could be negatively impacted by them, because cats have a really big impact on our urban ecosystems because they are non-native predators that songbirds and lizards are not adapted to coexist with, and are really hammered by them, and a lot of them are eaten, and because they just they don't really know how to defend themselves against these non-native predators. And so cats without coyotes in the ecosystem, or within that habitat, really are the top predator and really have nothing limiting them. And so they really are bold and numerous in areas where there's not any coyote activity. And so that's the case for the nature garden. So I was wondering if the lack of coyotes plus the lack of people kind of shooing them away, keeping them a little bit shy, would have a negative impact on other species. And I didn't document any birds getting killed, but it was really cool to see them eating, at least a couple of them were eating fox squirrels in front of my camera. And one of us was in the act of killing one, I think, or tenderizing it at least. And so it was really exciting to see that, because you don't see that a lot of times on cameras. That's actually the first time I saw a cat with a fox squirrel in its mouth since I've been monitoring the gardens for the past 7 years off and on. So
oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, so that was really exciting. I'm glad I didn't see one with a bird in its mouth or a lizard in its mouth. But also another highlight was the opossum, the Virginia opossum, which is a marsupial, the only marsupial that's native to North America, not native to the West Coast. But it's cool to see that there are multiple possums in the garden, and one that was likely carrying a bunch of young in its pouch. And in one of the videos you saw, there was a little joy on its side, just taking a little joy ride on Mama.
That was my favorite video out of the whole series.
Yeah, it was mine too. That and the cat with the squirrel were tied for first place.
I love the raccoon stuff too.
Thanks for reminding me about the raccoons. I think it's always entertaining to see raccoons. They have so much personality. They're probably the most aggressive predators out there in LA, regardless of size. And I think that's why they're able to stand up against coyotes and bigger predators, because of that bold behavior. But it's also just really adorable to see them fishing for food with their hands submerged in the water. I've seen them wrestling in the pond before. So they're just little feisty animals that are always entertaining to watch.
Yeah, I love raccoons. And it's also nice to see them just doing their own thing. They're not in garbage cans. They're they're just living their lives in the garden. And it's really nice to see that they're occupying and utilizing that space.
Yeah, they have, a lot of people don't know this, but why they have their hands in there is that they have extremely sensitive hands, a lot of nerves in there, so they can just blindly put their hands in the water and be really effective at grabbing crayfish or whatever invertebrates are under the water, or fish, and without even using their eyesight, which is pretty amazing.
That is very cool. And that brings me kind of to my next question as well. How did you go about choosing the locations of the trail cameras?
Yeah, good question. So when looking for wildlife, regardless if it's during the day or night, you look for habitat, places that will draw them in. So when I say habitat, I mean sources of water, food, places that are easy for them to use as travel corridors, and places for shelter, where they feel safe from potential predators or us. And so that's why I focused on the pond, for instance. And then another place I focused on was a travel corridor, which I was able to identify as a travel corridor because it had a latrine site. It had a lot of poop that was collecting over time, and not just in one spot, but all along that path. And so I knew that was a good spot to get regular activity of at least a couple species of mammals. And so, I focused on the ponds for sure, trails that were easy for animals to use to get from point A to point B, in areas where I found evidence of their usage of those spots with like tracks and scat. And scat is a fancy word for animal poop.
Yeah, I love a lot of the videos that were taken at the latrine site camera. That's where you got a lot of those, the pregnant opossum. You got even some songbirds there. And surprisingly, that's where that cat was hanging out a lot. And I think multiple cats at a certain point. So
Yeah.
it's great that you can use those, that sign to determine where to put the cameras, because that camera is where you got a lot of predation events too, perhaps because it was
Yeah.
kind of private, or
It's like the ideal site. There's a lot of things great that are happening all at the same time in that location, because it's under an ADA bridge, and so there's shelter, shade. It's closed off to the public. There's a barrier that like a chain barrier, so people can't walk through there. And there's also little storage spaces along that corridor where our gardeners put soil and things like that, tools. And I've actually seen a possum taking a nap in that little storage space. And that little corridor is also right up against our garden, part of the garden that has a lot of ornamental fruit. So there's a lot of pomegranate, orange, citrus fruit that I see often brought over there and munched on, because it's a latrine, a perfect travel corridor, shelter from people, and there's a lot of food there as well.
It's got all the things for a happy possum.
Yep.
Very cool. For all of you at home, just to let you know, we have made an available opossum coloring sheet available for you to download and print out and color during this event. A lot of people are curious on how the pandemic is affecting wildlife behavior.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us your take on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people, I was very excited to see in some areas that wildlife were kind of getting a break, getting a sense of relief from the lack of people in the area, and using areas that they hadn't used in a long time, or just using them earlier in the day. But for me here in Los Angeles, after having experienced camera trapping in people's backyards, including my own, it's become apparent that it's not all happy stories for all these animals. And I already mentioned the situation with birds, as these situations potentially turning into traps for some sensitive animals, like songbirds and animals that aren't as adaptable to the urban environment and what comes with that. And so, for instance, non-native predators. And for instance, I was filming a video during the day in my yard, and behind me, a cat jumped up on my fence and killed a lizard right in front of us. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about. There's a lot of, if these animals are facing relief, it's not only the animals that need it and really benefit from it in our like conservation concern, it's also these non-native species that put these native species at risk that are also getting relief. It's not one and not the other. They're all kind of experiencing this more flexibility as far as their ability to be out there, out and about, and be more bold even. And so that's my concern. But aside from that, I think the general picture in most urban settings like Los Angeles or DC, for instance, is that these animals really aren't affected, because there are always people out there, and even with the pandemic, there's a certain amount of density that is probably already, even at this point, when the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders their peak and people
Mm-hmm.
were inside the most, there's still enough people to be beyond the tolerance threshold for a lot of animals that are sensitive. And I'll even take it to mountain lions. Like a lot of people expected, oh, great, the safe at home orders are going to allow these mountain lions to be able to cross these freeways and feel comfortable all of a sudden.
Right.
And I just, not enough time for these animals to get comfortable, I don't think. And also,
There's still cars on the freeway,
yeah, there's still
right?
cars in the freeway. And even though we see it's not as congested and as rush hour usually is, it's still enough to be intimidating for a mountain lion or a bobcat or a coyote even. And so I think the impacts are still there. And even if they are, the traffic was dropped down low enough to where it felt safer, it would take a long time for them to perceive it as safer, I would think. Um, so that's kind of my point. I don't want to seem like a Debbie Downer or anything about this stuff, but I just see that it's not just this kumbaya moment where all the animals are able to frolic without care. It's more complicated than that. And for the most part, in urban settings, nothing's really changed for wildlife.
Right. No, I love that you bring up that point, and it's also context dependent, right? So when you take a look at the nature gardens, where is the nature gardens located, right? Like smack in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, and so there's
Exactly.
still plenty of people around.
Yeah, and some species are migratory. So I didn't see, like, for instance, a huge spike in bat activity because right now there's just not a lot of migrants coming through anyway.
Mhm.
So yeah, so we're not really, it just also depends on that as well.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, thank you. So in your mind, what is the importance of the nature gardens, or, what do the nature gardens mean to you?
One moment that's a great example of how beneficial this garden has become was a moment where a hoary bat, visited the nature gardens. And hoary bats are species that are urban sensitive compared to other bats, and you wouldn't expect them to see them deep within the city
Mhm.
because they only roost in foliage. And a lot of other bats are more adaptable that and can roost under a crevice in a roof or under a bridge, but these bats specifically only roost in foliage. So for this bat to feel comfortable to come to the gardens was a win in itself.
Mhm.
The fact that our trees, our big sycamore trees that are now pretty well established, and our coast live oak trees are providing a resource to these urban sensitive species to the point where they're able to take a break during the day. Um, and for whatever reason, it decided not to use our trees or moved over from our trees to one of our walls of one of our buildings, also in the garden. And somehow one of our staff members saw this bat, and was what made me proud is that what this individual did with this opportunity. And because we had been monitoring this garden for bats, there was always already this institutional knowledge
Mm.
that bats had flown over the garden before, that this isn't a totally wild situation that a bat is anywhere close to the museum, because that story has been told before,
Right.
thanks to some monitoring that we were doing in the gardens. And so this person quickly let others know, other education staff members know. They grabbed a spotting scope that you use to usually spot birds and take a look from far away.
Mhm.
And they positioned it out in the gardens, not just for their own benefit to get a closer look, but they invited all the public that was there at the time, because the museum was still open, to come look at this bat. And they were prepared to talk about the bat, its natural history, and what's unique about it, and why it's amazing, and why bats are important for urban ecosystems in general.
Mhm.
And I was really proud of that moment, even though I wasn't there, sadly, that day. I was excited to see how excited people were. People weren't grossed out. People weren't calling animal control all of a sudden. there's just this mindset that has been created at the museum that we're sharing with the public, that nature is here, nature is everywhere, and sometimes you'll even see a bat or a coyote or something else that you wouldn't expect roaming through your neighborhoods. And I think our gardens are preparing people for that by introducing them to plants that are inspiring them to care about nature, wildlife, to the point where they're more comfortable around it, that they're inspired to learn more about it. They want to potentially plant some of that in their garden or apartment terrace, or they are so inclined to join a community science project that is focused on exploring urban wildlife. And so at the end of the day, if a garden, a simple 3.5 acre garden, can transform people into stewards that are aware and appreciative of nature, I think that's a huge win and well worth the effort of creating this garden.
Wow, Miguel, thank you for sharing that story. We'll just end there. No, just kidding. That's a pretty great story. And I think that that's about all the time we have left for today's program. Miguel, I'd like to thank you for speaking with me about the nature in the gardens at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. For those of you who'd like to follow along with the community science program, you can find us online at Nature NLA. We'd also like to give a big shout out and thank you to LA 2050 and the Disney Conservation Fund for making this program possible. If any of you at home would like to share with us your completed opossum coloring sheet, you can post them online using the hashtag NatureInLA, and we will reshare them on our Facebook page. Thank you for joining us and have a great summer.